With its frontline forces failing to make any meaningful progress in Ukraine, the Russian military decided to go all in on a new secret weapon. A weapon with the potential to change the way the war was fought and cancel out one of Kyiv's biggest advantages. Russian developers and engineers spent months fine-tuning this system before rolling it out for its first test in real-world combat conditions. They believed that this was the moment that momentum would finally shift back in their favor. They were wrong. Russia's secret weapon failed within minutes, sending the Kremlin's commanders back to the drawing board yet again. The weapon in question is known as the Arena M. It's not a missile or drone, but an active protection system, or APS. As the name implies, an APS is a system designed to actively prevent damage to military vehicles, like tanks and armored infantry vehicles, from weapons like rockets and missiles. Famous examples include Israel's Trophy system and the United States Quick Kill APS. Russia has developed and used several active protection systems of its own over the years, including the Arena, which was originally designed in the early 1990s to counter threats like rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles. In 2026, however, the biggest threat to Russian armor isn't rockets, but drones. Ukraine has developed one of the biggest and strongest fleets of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in the world, boasting a dizzyingly diverse array of drones to carry out precision strikes against its enemy. And it's used those drones to remarkable effect, destroying thousands upon thousands of high-value Russian assets, from tanks and armored fighting vehicles to armored personnel carriers, engineering vehicles, command posts, artillery, radars, rocket launchers, and more. As the war progressed, Ukraine's UAVs became so impactful in frontline locations that Russia's commanders completely changed their tactics. Initially, they relied heavily on their armor advantage, sending sizable columns of armor and mechanized assault groups into towns, cities, and settlements, relying on sheer mass of metal and firepower to break through the Ukrainian defensive lines. But as Ukrainian drone operators began to eliminate tank after tank and vehicle after vehicle, the Kremlin realized it simply couldn't continue throwing its armor away so cheaply. So, Russia began using tanks and armored vehicles less frequently, relying instead on small assault groups of soldiers who were forced to either march into enemy territory on foot or aboard simple civilian vehicles like dirt bikes and SUVs. This made life significantly easier for Ukraine, with various units and battalions able to dig in and defend their locations more efficiently without having to worry about dozens of tanks being sent their way. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's military engineers got to work on ways to make their armored vehicles more resilient to Ukrainian UAV strikes. That's where the Arena M comes in. A new and improved version of the Arena APS, Russian officials claim that the Arena M can effectively intercept munitions coming from any angle. It does this by relying on a multi-functional Doppler radar, which scans the surrounding area for any incoming fast-moving objects like anti-tank missiles or RPGs. If and when a threat is detected, the Arena M's onboard computer automatically measures its speed, direction, and projected flight path. Then, before the projectile makes impact, the Arena M fires its own protective explosive towards it, sending a spray of metal shards into the projectile's flight path to either make it detonate in mid-air or break apart before it reaches the vehicle. Originally, since this system was designed to identify and activate against fast-moving targets, it wasn't considered effective against drones, which move far slower than missiles and rockets. But with drones becoming such a big threat, Russia decided to refine the Arena M to deal with them. And in July 2026, after months of work, Russian sources began to share the news that the T-72B3A main battle tanks, equipped with the latest version of the Arena M APS, were getting ready to support frontline assaults on Ukrainian positions. The reports also claimed that the Arena M was now able to intercept not only anti-tank missiles and shells, but also FPV drones. This had the potential to change everything. If Russia had truly found a way to make its tanks and armored vehicles virtually drone-proof, the intensity of its assaults could multiply overnight. The Kremlin will no longer need to be so cautious and conservative with its armored assets. All of a sudden, Ukraine could find itself facing off against vast tank columns, ready to blow holes in its defensive lines and reduce its fortifications to rubble, and it would no longer have an effective or reliable way to counter them. Russia, meanwhile, could redouble its efforts, making the most of the warm summer months to begin a bold new offensive in key areas along the front and potentially capturing key pieces of territory that could allow it to push forward and make greater gains. Even though thousands of its tanks and armored vehicles have already been destroyed, Russia still has one of the biggest tank armies in the world, thanks to its vast stockpiles of Soviet-era systems. And even though many of those systems date back decades and have various flaws compared to more modern tanks, they're far from worthless. They still have extremely powerful guns, capable of obliterating vehicles, structures, and soldiers in their path. In other words, despite the fact that drones became such a dominant force in the war, tanks and armored vehicles still have the potential to make a massive difference. Russia just needed to find a way to increase their survivability and allow them to stay on the battlefield long enough to make a difference. Up to that point, all of its efforts had failed. Equipping tanks with makeshift anti-drone armor, like cope cages for example, hadn't worked at all. Russian troops had tried welding spikes, lattices, mesh and wire nets on top of their tanks, making it more difficult for Ukrainian drones to strike their weak points. But Ukraine's pilots soon found ways to work around these defenses, like using bomber drones to blow holes in cope cages from above before sending strike drones through those gaps to finish the job. The cope cages also made life a lot harder for Russian tank crews. The added weight meant that their vehicles were slower and harder to maneuver, and the various spikes and other additions even made it quite perilous to get in and out of these tanks as well. The addition of the Arena M, however, seemed like it could be a much bigger step in the right direction for Russia. It wouldn't make tanks invincible. Some would still inevitably be damaged and destroyed, and the system was known to have certain limitations, like the fact that it could only carry 12 Interceptor projectiles at a time. This meant that all Ukraine had to do was send a dozen drones towards a tank to exhaust its APS before sending in a final strike UAV to deliver the knockout blow. Still, those 12 munitions could help to buy the Russian tanks valuable time to move across the battlefield and fire their weapons at Ukraine's defenses. They could also open up opportunities for other vehicles or troops on foot to move up behind their tanks and overwhelm Ukrainian positions. Plus, if Ukraine suddenly had to use 10 times as many drones to take out each Russian tank, that would dramatically shift the economic equation of the war. Kyiv would be forced to spend far greater sums of money and materials on drone production if it wanted to continue cancelling out the Kremlin's armour. And this all came at a time when Russia was well and truly on the back foot. Its forces were struggling to make any meaningful gains along the front lines and were even being pushed back in some areas. Its losses had reached unsustainable levels, with the Kremlin no longer able to recruit enough new troops to replace those that were being killed and injured in Ukraine. And even on the home front, Russia was quite literally burning due to repeated Ukrainian UAV strikes on targets like oil refineries, supply lines, command posts, and logistics facilities. With its economy in tatters and its prospects of victory growing slimmer by the day, Russia needed some way to turn the tide. It needed to get its armor back in the fight, and the Arena M appeared the one and only way to make that happen. All that was left was to put it to the test. In late July, that test arrived. But before we look at what happened and how it turned out for both sides, you're watching The Military Show, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. On July 22, Russian forces launched their largest mechanized assault in months in the occupied Donetsk region of Ukraine. Details of the assault were shared online by Ukraine's Azov Brigade. On July 22, the occupiers, using forces of the 8th and 41st Armies along with the 90th Tank Division, attempted an assault in the sector held by the 1st Corps Azov of the National Guard of Ukraine, involving dozens of units of armoured and light vehicles. Additional news reports reveal that tanks, armoured fighting vehicles, BM-21 Grad rocket systems, commercial trucks, and supporting infantry were all involved in this assault, along with multiple two-person motorcycle teams operating independently of the main mechanized force. The Azov Brigade reports that Russia also relied on its Gerberer and Lancet strike drones in an attempt to control the airspace above the battlefield, along with a Tornado S multiple launch rocket system, MLRS. This was a sizable force, the likes of which Ukraine hadn't had to deal with for over a year. Russia's commanders also ordered the force to leave large amounts of space in between each vehicle, presumably to provide room for them to maneuver or take evasive action if they encountered the likes of mines, rockets or drones. In addition, the large mechanized force advanced from multiple axes, converging towards several small settlements around the village of Shakhove. Again, this appeared to be a reasonably smart tactical decision. Rather than attacking with one dense column, Russia divided its forces and gave Ukraine more problems to deal with. Azov reports that the assault lasted for approximately 4 hours, and it didn't end well for the Russians at all. Perhaps they hoped that Ukraine wouldn't be expecting such a vast armoured force to arrive at its doorstep. Maybe they believed that after so many months of dealing with small assault squads, Ukrainian defenders might have forgotten how to deal with tanks and armoured vehicles. They were also banking on the Arena M to be the difference maker, the secret weapon that Ukraine would have no answer for. All of those hopes proved unfounded and fell apart in a matter of minutes. This particular part of the front is especially well defended, and the Ukrainian military isn't in the habit of leaving things to chance or simply hoping for the best. It takes numerous active measures to defend its valuable territory and prepare for every eventuality, and it was more than ready to repel the Russian assault. As soon as Ukraine's reconnaissance drones detected the advancing force, a rapid response plan was put into motion. Azov reports that its own troops, along with attached units, predicted the paths the Russians would take and blocked them. They set up mines and obstacles, while also using tactical aviation strikes to damage nearby bridges over the river that runs around and through Shakhove village, disrupting the enemy's advance. Faced with no clear way forward, the Russians tried to construct pontoon bridges to forge new paths over the river. In doing so, however, they simply gave Ukraine more targets to aim for. Within minutes, the skies over the battlefield were filled with FPV drones and heavy bomber drones, with Ukraine also relying on nearby artillery units to rain down fire from above on the Russian forces. Russia's Tornado S MLRs was wiped out, while tactical aviation strikes eliminated the pontoons before they could be used. As for the tanks and other armoured vehicles, many of those were wiped out as well, including those equipped with the Arena M. Footage clearly shows a T-72B3A tank suffering a drone strike while in motion before additional UAVs moved in to finish the job. There are no images or videos showing the Arena M actually functioning to repel any Ukrainian UAVs. That doesn't mean it didn't work at all, as this was a reportedly 4-hour conflict and there are only a few minutes of video footage available from it. The Arena M may indeed have succeeded in taking out a few drones, but in the end, it clearly wasn't enough to keep Russia's tanks alive long enough for this assault to succeed. The numbers speak for themselves. Azov reports, as a result of the professional actions of all units involved under the command of the 1st Corps Azov of the National Guard of Ukraine, using barrel artillery, multiple launch rocket systems and attack drones, the following were destroyed: 7 tanks, 6 armoured combat vehicles, 1 BM-21 Grad MLRS, 1 Tornado S MLRS, 3 units of special equipment, and 47 units of light vehicles. 123 occupiers were eliminated and 29 were wounded. The mechanized assault was repelled. The Russian Ministry of Defense has kept quiet about the operation, most likely out of shame and embarrassment at the extent of its failure. And while there is a chance that some of the infantry or motorcycle teams managed to make it past the main engagement area, this assault has to go down as a disaster for the Kremlin's forces. Numerous Russian military bloggers have stated as much, with several of the biggest voices condemning the Kremlin's commanders for giving the green light to what they feel was such a stupid and wasteful assault. The officer on the Front channel, for example, wrote, "In the era of total drone dominance, throwing mechanized columns into frontal assaults is not a tactic, but suicide. This is not a war. This is a massacre carried out by the incompetent people from the Central Military District. The new active protection system of the T-72? Useless. It didn't save anyone. It didn't work. It's July 2026 and our idiot generals are still storming in columns. This is disgraceful. This is the height of incompetence, and such decisions must be held accountable to the fullest extent." Russian writer and political activist Vladimir Kucherenko, better known by his pen name Maxim Kalashnikov, agreed. Writing on Telegram, Kalashnikov expressed shock that such assaults were still being carried out in the 5th year of the war, despite the fact that everyone should be aware of the threat of a drone war. He went on to demand that those who give the orders for such assaults are held accountable, stating that this is the only way the meat grinder will ever end. These aren't the views of everyday Russians, they're the views of some of the country's most extreme nationalists, the kind of people who want to see the Russian army wipe out Ukraine as we know it, and they largely agree that the country's current strategy is doomed to fail. And it's not hard to see why. In a matter of hours, Russia lost numerous high-value assets and approximately 150 troops, and it made no progress whatsoever. It went all in on the Arena M, believing that this system would make the difference. It even stripped away the spikes and cages from its tanks, since it was so confident that this new and improved APS would be more than sufficient to keep them alive. As the evidence shows, it wasn't. Analysts have pored over the footage from the conflict, with some concluding that the Arena M didn't even fire and others believing it managed to eliminate a few drones before running out of munitions. Either way, the conclusion is clear. This system isn't the game changer the Kremlin wants it to be. It's simply not strong enough, meaning that Russia still has zero answer to Ukraine's drone dominance. As long as that continues, the Kremlin's forces will be stuck in a rut, forced to choose between two tactical approaches that have both proven to be ineffective. On the one hand, they might continue to bring back tanks and launch more mechanized assaults, hoping that the sheer volume of their armor eventually proves enough to overwhelm Ukraine's defenses. That's unlikely to happen, however, as Ukraine has proven on countless occasions that its drones are more than a match for even the best Russian tanks. On the other hand, Russia might decide to follow the advice of the military bloggers and keep its armor in reserve, ordering its engineers to work on improving the Arena M even further. Meanwhile, it'll have little choice but to continue sending small squads of soldiers towards Ukrainian positions, hoping that the odd one or two manage to infiltrate enemy positions and disrupt them from within. It's a less wasteful strategy, but extremely unlikely to produce the kind of broad, sweeping gains that Russia's President Vladimir Putin wants to see to back up his belief that this war is still somehow winnable. And so, the Russian army remains stuck in limbo, trapped in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, in which every approach fails, and even the faintest slivers of progress are all but impossible to achieve. Ukraine's military, meanwhile, is only getting stronger. The country recently appointed a fearless new commander-in-chief, Major General Mikhailo Drapatyi, who you can learn more about in this video. Or to learn more about Kyiv's long-term plan to drag Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table and bring an end to this conflict at last, check out this video. And finally, for more breaking news reports, insightful analysis and detailed breakdowns of the biggest battles, military equipment and tactics in the Russia-Ukraine war, subscribe to the Military Show today.